Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study this morning. This morning we'll be continuing our series trying to answer the question, what does the Bible mean when it uses the word church? Is it talking about a local assembly? Is it talking about a universal assembly? Or is it talking about both? In our last lesson we explained basically how we were going to go about in this study, how we were going to go about studying these different verses. So I would ask you to please go back and listen to part 1 before you begin this study if you haven't listened to it yet, because what we talk about in part 1 is very important to understanding how we're going to approach this study. Let me just say very quickly, in part 1 the basic idea is this: to understand terminology in the Bible as well as in any language, there's a basic rule that needs to be applied. We always take the normal, usual meaning of a word and apply that meaning to a sentence unless the context clearly dictates otherwise. And the example I used in that first lesson was in the sentence, he saw the ball. If that's all we have is that one sentence, he saw the ball. If the normal, usual meaning for ball is a round or an oblong object that's used in sports and is used by children to play, then in our mind, when we read the statement, he saw the ball, we should be thinking, he saw a round object that kids used to play with, or that maybe sports are being used for sports. That type of idea. However, if we read a sentence that said, a wife and her husband danced at the ball, we can tell from the context of that sentence, when you're talking about dancing at the ball, you can tell that's not talking about the round object that we commonly think of as a ball. In that case, we need to look for a new definition for the word ball. And sure enough, if we study the word ball, we find that word can also be used to talk about a formal type of dance. A formal gathering where people dance at that gathering. So that makes more sense when it says the wife and her husband danced at the ball. In that case, the word ball is talking about a formal gathering that people have when they dance. Okay. That's the basic principle we're going to be applying in this study. I explained in great detail, and I'm not going to get into it again, but I explained in great detail how we can come to an understanding of what the word church in the Bible, what its normal meaning is. The word church, which is translated from a Greek word ekklesia, that word ecclesia, or the word church, means, in the Bible, normally, a local visible assembly. So we're going to begin this morning by looking at different texts that we find in the Bible that uses the word church, that are questionable texts. They might mean a local assembly, they might mean a universal assembly, so we're going to be looking at these. But we're going to be applying the meaning for the word church. We're going to apply that to, and believe that to mean a local visible assembly, and we're going to apply it to these texts. The only time that we will have to stop and look for a new definition for the word ecclesia is when the context clearly indicates a local assembly cannot be being talked about in the text. Okay, so again, if you would look back at the first lesson, that'll explain everything in much more detail for you. So as we begin our study this morning, let's just keep in mind that's the basic principle of how we're going to be doing this study. Let's look, if we could please, at the first text that we have in mind to study this morning, and that's Matthew chapter 16. Matthew 16, verses 16 through 20. As you're turning, keep in mind, all of these notes can also be gotten from my text blog. If you go to settledinheaven.wordpress.com, there you'll find my blog, Settled in Heaven. If you go to the tab that says Free eBooks and Study Guides, I believe is what it says. If you click on that tab, You'll see a long list of study guides you can download for free. Look for the one entitled The Importance of the Local Assembly. Go to the very back of that study guide, to the last portion of it, and you're going to find all of the notes to these lessons are back there, just in much greater detail. So if you have more questions after you hear this video about some of the things I said, I would suggest you first go and get that study guide, because there I explain in more detail all these texts we look at. Then, if you still have questions, feel free to leave comments on my text blog. Okay, concerning that, you can do it at the study guide page. You can leave a comment. You can leave a comment at the lesson. This lesson is part number 2 of the series, the church, universal, local, or both. You can find that lesson on the blog and leave the comment there. You can email me at settledinheaven. It's settledinheaven@gmail.com if you'd like to email me with the question. There's several different ways to contact me. Any of the ways, I'll get it. So just look on my website, look on the blog, and you'll find the different ways to contact me. Please feel free to ask any questions you would have after you listen to this video, if there's something that's still a question to you. Okay, let's begin by looking at Matthew 16:16 through 20. Matthew 16:16 through 20. Here we find the word church being used. And again, the question is, what type of church is this talking about in this context? Is it talking about a local assembly or a universal assembly of all believers? But keep in mind the basic principle we're going to apply to this word church, the idea of a local assembly. And as long as the context allows for that, we're going to look no further, because the local assembly is the commonly used, the common definition of the word church in the New Testament. And Simon Peter answered and said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said unto him, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. And I say also unto thee, that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my local assembly, my church. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then charged he his disciples, and that they should tell no man that he was Jesus the Christ. Here Christ is talking to his apostles. Keep in mind, in the previous series on the importance of the local assembly, we saw that his apostles were the first members of his local church. While Christ was still on the earth, he was the pastor of the local church at Jerusalem, and the apostles were the first members of that church. Here we find Christ addressing his local assembly. That first group that was the beginnings of the local assembly, the apostles, Christ is addressing. Simon Peter talks, and he says, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto me, but my Father which is in heaven. In other words, he's saying, Peter, you've come to understand and to believe that I'm the true Christ, or the Messiah. You've come to understand that I'm the Son of the living God. The only way you can come to that is through the divine intervention of God the Father. A fallen, sinful human being, apart from God's intervention, cannot come to an understanding of these things. Okay, he takes it a step further then. He says, I say also unto thee, Thou art Peter. So now he gives Simon this name, Peter. Upon this rock I will build my church. What's the rock? The statement that Peter had just made, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus says, look, it's that very principle that Jesus is the Messiah. It's the very principle that Jesus is the very Son of God. That's one of the basic core principles that his local assembly will be built upon. He says, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Meaning what? As long as we have an earth that exists, until Christ comes back, there will always be at least one local assembly in existence. Get what I'm saying? The gates of hell will never prevail against the local church. There will always be at least one local church in existence on the face of the planet until Christ comes back. He's promised that. The organization, the assembly, the local church will always exist. Satan will not be able to overcome that organization or that assembly. So someplace, somewhere, you're going to find at least one local church on earth until Christ comes back. He goes on and says, I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Now keep in mind, he's talking not only to Peter, but to the apostles that are with him. He says, look, unto you, unto that local assembly, I'm going to give the keys of the kingdom of heaven. What are the keys of the kingdom of heaven? The gospel message and the authority that goes behind that gospel message. Look, when a local church preaches the gospel message, if that gospel message is accepted by faith, that gives entrance into the kingdom of heaven. Just as much as if Christ himself was speaking that message. So he says, look, I'm putting my authority behind you ministering the gospel message to the lost. I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. In other words, a part of the message of the gospel is this. If you accept this message by faith, you will be loosed from your sins, and you will have an eternal dwelling place in heaven. Christ says, you've got my authority behind that local church. So when you take that message to the lost, you don't have to worry about the fact maybe Christ isn't going to live up to this gospel because the local church is taking it instead of Christ himself. He says, no. He says, I'm putting my authority behind this message just as much as if it was me, myself, speaking it. Likewise, a part of the gospel message is, if a person rejects that message, they will be condemned eternally and remain in the bondage of sin. Again, the Lord is saying, my authority is behind you, local church. When you take the gospel message to the lost, don't be afraid to warn them about rejecting it, because I'll live up to it. When you warn them about the fact they will stay under sin's bondage, and they will be facing eternal death if they reject this message, I'm going to live up to it just as if I myself was speaking it. Finally, then charged he his disciples that they should tell no man that he was Jesus the Christ. Folks, there is no reason why the word church here cannot mean a local assembly. There's not. When we understand the apostles were the first local assembly on earth, they made up that first assembly in the beginning before others were added to it. When we understand that, there is no reason why the word church here has to mean a universal assembly. It can easily mean a local church. Therefore, what? Therefore, we accept it as local church. No use in looking any further. That's the normally accepted meaning of church in the New Testament. It applies in this case, so we go on. Let's look at the next text. Acts 2, 41 through 47. Acts 2, 41 through 47. This is one of the texts that I really believe it's clear that it's talking about a local church, but I did want to cover it anyhow. Look what it said. Then they that gladly received his word were baptized. The same day were added unto them about 3,000 souls. Who's the them? The local church at Jerusalem. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, and breaking of bread and in prayers. That's the believers who have joined the local church now. They continue to meet together, observing worship times, observing the ordinances, and having fellowship with one another. Fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles, which is what? Accrediting that local assembly. We looked at all this in the previous series on the importance of the local assembly. All that believed were together and had all things in common. They sold their possessions and goods and parted them to all men as every man had need. They continued daily with one accord in the temple, breaking bread from house to house, did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart. You can see the unity there this local assembly had. Praising God, having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved. Who's the church here? Clearly in the context, it's a local assembly. When it says he's adding to the church such as should be saved, the idea was this. The Lord worked in the hearts of the lost, he brought them to salvation, and then he led them into the church membership of this local church at Jerusalem. Folks, the word church can easily mean a local assembly here. No need to go any further. Let's look at Acts 7, 37 through 41. This is that Moses which was said unto the children of Israel, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me, him shall ye hear. This is he that was in the church in the wilderness, with the angel that spake to him in Mount Sinai, and with all our fathers who received these lively oracles to give unto us. Here we're talking about an Old Testament event. It was the nation of Israel being led out of the country of Egypt. They were being led out of the enslavery that they had been facing. And it's talking about as they traveled through the wilderness, making their way to the promised land, they are described here as a church. What's the idea? Folks, stop and think about it. Before, when the nation of Israel was in the country of Egypt, they were mixed with the Egyptian people. God called them out. Remember, ecclesia means what? To be summoned out, or to summon forth. God calls the physical nation of Israel out of Egypt, and they begin to travel in the wilderness. As they are traveling in the wilderness, what are they forming? A visible local assembly of God's people. Now, of course, this isn't the local church we've been looking at in the New Testament, but this is a church in the sense. It's a local, visible assembly. They were separated out from Egypt. They are now traveling as a local, visible group of people. They're traveling as a group through the wilderness. No reason to look for any other meaning to the word church. It clearly means here a local, visible assembly. Let's look, if we could please, at Acts 12. Now about that time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. Okay? That would be what? The local church at Jerusalem. Let's apply that for now and see if it'll fit. To vex certain of the local church at Jerusalem. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. James was a member of the local church at Jerusalem. Because he saw it please the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also, another member of that local assembly. Then were the days of unleavened bread. When he had apprehended him, he put him in prison, delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Peter therefore was kept in prison, but prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. What's happening here? The local church is meeting together, praying for Peter to be released. When he had considered the thing, this is verse 12, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. There you have a local gathering of people praying for Peter. What's this talking about? To me it's clear, a local assembly. That'll easily fit the context. No need to look any further. Let's look at Acts 15, 1 through 4. And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved. When therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputation with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain other of them should go up to Jerusalem unto the apostles and elders about this question. And being brought on their way by the church, okay, that would be the local church. I believe that in the context is the local church at Antioch, I believe. They were the ones that sent Paul and Barnabas to the local church at Jerusalem. So I believe the first church there is talking about the church at Antioch. They passed through Phoenicia and Samaria, declaring the conversion of the Gentiles. They caused great joy unto all the brethren. And when they were come to Jerusalem, they were received of the church, that'd be the local church at Jerusalem, and of the apostles and elders, and they declared all things that God had done with them. Again, folks, clearly talking about local assemblies that can easily fit in the context. You have the local assembly at Antioch escorting them and getting them on their way. When they come to Jerusalem, you have the church membership meeting them, and included in that membership were the apostles and the elders of that church, the local church at Jerusalem, meeting them. Again, clearly in the context, there's no reason to make the church mean anything but a local assembly. Acts 19, 29 through 34. And the whole city was filled with confusion. And having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater. And when Paul would have entered into the place, and unto the people, the disciples suffered him not. Certain of the chief of Asia, which were his friends, sent unto him, desiring him that he would not adventure himself into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing, and some another, for the assembly. That's the word ecclesia. That's the same word normally translated church in the New Testament. Here it's translated assembly. For the assembly was confused, and the more part knew not whether they were come together. Notice they were come together. It's a local assembly of people gathered together. In this case, it's not a religious assembly, it's a political assembly. But the point is, it's local in nature and it's visible in nature. It's a group of the citizens of this city coming together to meet. It's like a political gathering or a legal gathering, that type of idea, but it's still a local, visible gathering. And Alexander beckoned with the hand and would have made his defense unto the people. But when they knew that he was a Jew, all with one accord, with one voice, about the space of 2 hours cried out, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. Then if you go on to Acts 19:35 through 41, we find again that type of assembly talked about. When the town's clerk had appeased the people, he said, Ye men of Ephesus, what man is there that knoweth not how that the city of the Ephesians is a worshipper of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Jupiter? Seeing then that these things cannot be spoken against, ye ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. For ye were brought hither these men, which are neither robbers of churches, plural, so it has to be a local church, nor yet blasphemers of your goddess. Wherefore, if Demetrius and the craftsmen which are with them have a matter against any man, the law is open, and there are deputies. Let them implead one another. But if ye inquire anything concerning other matters, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly. That would be a local, visible gathering of people at this, again, political or legal assembly. For we are in danger to be called in question of this day's uproar, there being no cause whereby we may give an account of this concourse. And when he had thus spoken, he dismissed the assembly. Again, folks, you can see in every usage in this text, you're talking about a local, visible group of people. Finally, for today, let's look at Acts 20:17 through 28. And from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church. That would be the local church at Ephesus. Okay, so from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the local church at Ephesus. When they were come to him, he said unto them, Ye know from the first day that I came into Asia, after what manner I have been with you at all seasons, serving the Lord with all humility in mind, and with many tears and temptations which befell you by the lying in wait of the Jews. There he's talking about all that he went through to help form the local church at Ephesus, and then to instruct them and to indoctrinate them and to do his missionary journeys in general. Paul went through a tremendous amount of persecution. Why did he do it? For the sake of the local assemblies that he had started, or that he helped to start. Of course, we know the Lord is one who actually starts local assemblies through his Spirit, but Paul played an active role in the forming of those assemblies from a human standpoint. That's what he's talking about. All that he went through. If you want to drop down toward the end, about verse 27, For I have not shunned you to declare all the counsel of God. So Paul says, Elders of the church of Ephesus, I've taught you the truth. I've gone through great persecution for the sake of your church and these other churches as I went about my missionary journey. Take heed therefore unto yourselves and to all the flock over which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers to feed the church of God. Folks, in the context, the elders of the local church at Ephesus, what was their responsibility? Feed the local church at Ephesus. Be sure they were taught properly. It wasn't their responsibility to feed every believer on the face of the planet Earth. It was their responsibilities as elders of the local church at Ephesus to teach that local assembly these truths that Paul had taught to them. To feed the church of God which he hath purchased with his own blood. In what way did Christ purchase local churches with his blood? In what ways did he do that? Folks, when the Lord died on the cross, he not only died for individual Christians to pay the price for their sins, but he also died to pay the price for the sins of the local church as a body. Churches commit sin as a body. As a body, they make wrong decisions at times. They commit sin. One of the grave sins is to leave their first love. If you remember in the book of Revelation, the Lord talks to a local church and says, you, being the local assembly, have left your first love. If you don't get things right, I'm going to take your candlestick out of the way. Meaning, he's going to take them out of existence. They may exist as an organization, but they would no longer have his authority behind them. It would be as if they weren't a church. They were just a group of people getting together. That's one example of a sin that a local church as a body commits. Here we're told the Lord died for a local church to pay the price for those sins, for the local church's sins as a body. That's why the Lord can forgive those sins. That's why there is such a thing as a church being allowed to repent of sin. Because the church as a body, Christ died for as well, giving them the ability to receive forgiveness of their sins as a body. Not just the sins of the individual in the church, but as a body. Not only that, keep in mind, we're told in Ephesians that the Lord uses the washing of water by the word in a church to purify that church and to drive sin out of the church. That's all a function, too, of the idea of the Lord dying on the cross for that local assembly, to allow the word to have its work in the assembly, driving sin out. And that a part of that driving the sin out does involve, again, the forgiveness of the sins of that local assembly. So it's through the teaching of God's word in assembly, it'll drive the sin out. Not only the sin in the lives of the individual believers who are members of that assembly, but also it will drive out the sins of an assembly where the church has made bad decisions at times and they've sinned against the Lord at times. They can receive forgiveness. How does that happen? As the word is preached, the washing of water of the word purifies that church, driving it out. And as the church then repents of that sin, they too can receive forgiveness of sin. We'll stop there. But again, you can see in this last text, folks, there's no reason to look for another definition. The definition for a local assembly can easily fit here. So far as we're looking at these questionable texts, everyone so far can easily accept the normal meaning of the word ecclesia. And that is local church. They can easily accept that meaning in every one of these texts. There's no use in looking any further. There's no use in trying to find another definition for that word church, because so far, in the context, it easily fits. Okay, Lord willing, we'll continue in our study of these different verses that are questionable in the hopes of coming to an understanding. What does the Bible mean when it uses the word church? Does it mean a local assembly? Does it mean a universal and visible assembly? Or could it mean both, depending on the context? Lord bless you as you study His Word.